Today, we're going to cover 3 wild medical mysteries. And if you like this kind of content, remember we have a whole award-winning podcast called Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where all we do is cover stories just like these every single week. So make sure you check that out. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please swat the like button like it's a fly hovering over your food. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of January 22nd, 2024, an elderly woman named Janet Lee sat in front of her computer in an office on the second floor of her home in Newcastle, England. She was going over some recent bank statements, but it was kind of hard. She was distracted because all she could hear was her boyfriend downstairs talking to someone. So Janet's boyfriend was a guy named Richard O'Connell, and he and Janet had been together for about 20 years. Now, despite not officially being married, they sort of functioned like a married couple. They lived together, they shared everything. In fact, Janet had even written Richard into her will. Janet thought her and Richard would be together forever. I mean, clearly, if you're writing him into your will. And she assumed that that feeling was reciprocated, that Richard also felt like they were together forever. But lately, their relationship had gotten pretty rocky, and in fact, both of them had begun openly talking about the possibility that they might need to break up. Now, nothing was set in stone, and by no means were they destined for a breakup, but it was suddenly, a possibility, and that was really hard for Janet to deal with. And so, as Janet sat upstairs trying to do these bank statements, but, getting completely sidetracked just by the sound of Richard's voice, part of the reason that was so distracting is, Richard was all she could think about. What would happen if they broke up? What would her life look like? And so before long, her mind was kind of wandering, and no longer was it the bank statements, it was, what does the future hold for me? It seems so uncertain. And so as Janet is having this moment upstairs, she suddenly hears Richard start yelling downstairs. And at first, it kind of sounded like maybe he was yelling at the person he had been talking to. But the more Janet listened, she could tell it really wasn't that he was yelling as much as he was screaming, like he was screaming out in pain or something. And so Janet got out of her chair and ran downstairs to see what was going on. And when she did, she looked towards the front door and she saw there was this man who she didn't recognize, but he looked weirdly familiar to her. He was wearing a white lab coat, his back was to her, and he was walking out the front door. And before she could even begin to process who this guy was and what he was doing here, she heard the sound of Richard again kind of calling out in pain, less loudly this time, but definitely in real pain. Then she turned, and sure enough, there was Richard in the living room, clutching his shoulder and grimacing like something was really hurting him. And so Janet, she walked over to him and she's like, what's going on? Like, what's wrong with you? And who was that guy? And tell me, what's happening here? And so Richard, through gritted teeth, would tell her that he had just gotten a COVID vaccine shot and it really hurt. And that guy who had just given it to him was a guy from NHS, the National Health Service, and he just came by to administer the shot. And so Janet heard what he said, but it wasn't really computing. Like, why aren't you getting the shot done at the doctor's office? Why are you having somebody come here to administer it? That's unusual. But, as she was thinking about this, she could clearly see that what was really important right now was that Richard was in agonizing pain. I mean, he was holding his arm and kind of rocking back and forth, moaning. Clearly, he was having some sort of reaction to the shot. And so she forgot about the weirdness around why he got the shot and how he got the shot, and said to him, hey, do you want to go to the hospital? I can drive you. And at this, Richard kind of sat up straight and took a deep breath, clearly trying to calm himself down. And even though obviously his shoulder still hurt from the shot, he said to Janet that, the guy from the NHS told me this was normal. There's pain associated with this particular shot, and it would just go away on its own. And so I'm just gonna wait and let this thing fade. At this point, Janet was still worried about Richard, but, he seemed pretty confident that this was not a big deal. And so she decided she would simply follow his lead. And she said, okay, if that's what you want to do. And then she turned and she went upstairs and continued trying to do her bank statements. But 2 days later, Janet did end up driving Richard to the hospital. Because over those 48 hours since Richard got that COVID shot, the spot on his arm, the injection site, had turned red and began to blister and bleed. and then eventually it turned black. And so at that point, they went to the ER. Hospital doctors would diagnose Richard with something called necrotizing fasciitis, which is a bacterial infection more commonly known as flesh-eating disease. Basically, the skin and muscle of Richard's arm was dying and rotting, but from the inside out. The doctors told Richard he would have to have emergency surgery to remove the rotting flesh to stop the spread of this infection. But before they could even do that, they needed to figure out how this infection had even begun. And so at this point, Richard began telling the doctors all about how, 2 days earlier he'd gotten his COVID shot, and pretty much right away it had been so painful, and then it blistered and bled and turned black. And then also, over the course of this discussion that Janet is listening to as well, Richard began describing the NHS guy who had actually come to his house. Now remember, Janet had only seen this guy for a brief second when she had run downstairs. She had seen him walking out the front door, she just saw the white lab coat, but something about him seemed weirdly familiar, but she kind of put that thought out of her mind. But now, as she's listening to Richard describe this NHS guy with a little more detail this time, suddenly something clicked. She realized she knew why this guy seemed so familiar. And this realization filled her with horror. It would turn out that NHS nurse was not really an NHS nurse. Instead, they were a man that both Janet and Richard knew very well. However, they were extremely well disguised, and so Janet and Richard did not recognize them. This man's name was Thomas Kwan. And Thomas, after coming inside their home, did not inject Richard with COVID-19 vaccine. Instead, he injected Richard with a deadly pesticide called iodomethane. That pesticide immediately caused that excruciating pain that Richard was feeling that caused him to scream out, and ultimately killed and began to rot away the flesh in his arm. It would turn out Thomas Kwan was Janet's son, and he was furious at her for putting Richard in her will and allowing Richard to get her house when she died. And so he decided he would basically inject poison into Richard, killing Richard to secure the house for himself. But Richard would survive the ordeal. He would have to undergo several pretty intense surgeries, but he ended up being okay. As for Thomas, he was arrested and convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 31 years in prison. You know that feeling when you get totally lost in a story, like you're on the edge of your seat the whole time, start to finish? Well, that's the experience that Audible brings right to you. Are you in the mood for some heart-pounding, spine-tingling suspense? Or maybe an epic quest across uncharted worlds? Well, either way, Audible's got you covered. Whether you're stuck in traffic, hitting the gym, or just winding down after a long day, there's always a story waiting to pull you in. Thrillers, fantasies, true crime, you name it. And the best part is, it's all just a play button away. Unleash your adventurous side with Audible's vast library of entertainment. Discover exclusive, captivating Audible originals you won't find anywhere else. Be the first to experience exciting new releases from your favorite authors. Currently, I am completely sucked in to Island of the Lost by Joan Druitt. It's a real story about these people who get shipwrecked on this totally austere island out in the middle of nowhere. It is fascinating and totally intense. You should check it out. So, what's your next adventure? Find out with Audible. Start listening today when you sign up for a free 30-day trial at audible.com/Mr. Ballin. On a sunny afternoon in August of 2014, a 24-year-old tourist, who we're going to call Angela Lyons, drove a rented moped through a busy street in Vietnam. Angela had come here about a week earlier from Scotland, where she lived, and so far the trip had been great. She'd been going to nightclubs and partying and eating local food and swimming in local rivers. I mean, all in all, she was having a blast. And now she was just cruising slowly on her moped, looking at all the shops around her and kind of taking in the scenery. And at some point, as she was driving, she turned her head, and then she felt her moped hit something really hard, and she actually fell off her bike onto the ground. She hit her head pretty hard, but luckily she was wearing a helmet, and so she was able to stand up and kind of assess that she was physically going to be okay. And she looked and saw what she had run into, and it was actually another moped. And fortunately, the crash was kind of low speed, and so the other moped driver clearly was physically okay as well, and their mopeds were not actually damaged at all. And so after she said she was sorry, and the two kind of just acknowledged that they were just gonna go their separate ways, The other moped driver hopped back on their moped and drove off, and Angela, just to make sure she really was okay here, because again, she hit her head pretty hard on the concrete. And so Angela, she took off her helmet and kind of felt around her scalp, and sure enough, she felt a little bump on her head from where she'd hit the ground, but other than that, she seemed fine. Now, because it was a head injury, albeit a small one, Angela did consider just going to the hospital just to be sure. But, as she felt it a couple more times, she's like, you know what, it's pretty small. This is not a big deal. I'm okay. And so she put her helmet back on, got on her moped, and went on about her business. About a week later, Angela was back home in Glasgow, Scotland, and she was inside of her doctor's office about to be examined. Following that moped accident, Angela had stayed in Vietnam for a few more days. And the whole time, she had checked that bump on her head every single day, and it had gone away pretty quickly. However, when she landed back home in Scotland, almost right away, she began developing this kind of startling new symptom that she couldn't help but feel must be connected to the moped accident, and it made her really scared. And so she had gone to the doctor. Her new symptom were these sudden kind of extreme nosebleeds. And so she had made an appointment to go see her doctor to figure out what the heck was going on. And so finally, Angela's doctor came into the room, and he would examine her, and he would look at her nose and her head, and he would listen to her story about the moped. But after he was done with the exam, he would tell Angela that he did not think her nosebleeds had anything to do with the moped accident. Much more realistically, the nosebleeds were from her body adjusting to the weather in Scotland. Vietnam, it was a very hot environment, and Scotland was very cold, and so that shift was likely causing these nosebleeds. And so the doctor recommended that Angela put some Vaseline inside of her nostrils to keep it moist, and just wait for this to clear up as her body transitioned back to Scotland. A few days later, Angela was back home inside of her bathroom looking into a mirror. She was applying some Vaseline to her nostrils. Now, she had been doing this every day, multiple times a day, since the doctor had made that recommendation, but despite following the doctor's orders, her nosebleeds had persisted. If anything, they were getting worse. She was having these things multiple times a day. But for now, Angela simply turned on her shower and waited for the water to warm up, and then she hopped inside. And after a few minutes of just kind of standing under the water, Angela began just kind of touching her nose, something she was doing a lot of, since these nosebleeds had begun. Except as she touched her nose, she began to feel something weird sort of deep inside of her nostril that she maybe hadn't noticed before, and at some point, she actually pushed pretty hard on whatever this was inside of her nasal cavity. And when she did that, it sent this blinding wave of pain over her, and then simultaneously, blood began pouring out of her nose, and she couldn't get it to stop. It was like this flood of just constant bleeding, and it terrified Angela. She'd had these terrible nosebleeds, but this was the worst one, and it was clearly connected to something inside of her nose. And so she's starting to panic, blood's getting everywhere, and she's thinking, this has gotta be connected to that moped accident. Maybe I have some horrible brain injury. Maybe I'm dying here. And so in a panic, she jumps out of the shower, towels off, gets dressed, and rushes to the nearest hospital. When Angela got to the emergency room, a nurse quickly brought her into an exam room and had her sit down and tilt her head back so the nurse could look into her nostrils to see what was going on. And so Angela, she's got all this gauze to kind of trap the blood, and she's got her head way back, and she's letting the nurse do this exam. And after a while, Angela starts to realize that this exam is taking a really long time. The nurse is just kind of standing there, clearly looking at her nostrils, but not saying anything. And, from Angela's perspective, she can't really see the nurse. Her head is tilted too far back. But the silence that's grown in the room is so loud at this point that Angela finally just kind of sits up and looks at the nurse to see what's going on here. And she sees the nurse is kind of frozen, like she's looking at Angela's nostrils like she can't believe what she's seen. And then the nurse kind of snaps out of it and looks at Angela and says, "Stay calm. I'm gonna get the doctor." And Angela's like, "I am calm. What's going on here?" But then the nurse just turns around and speed walks out of the room. It would turn out Angela's primary care doctor had been right when he said he didn't think her nosebleeds had anything to do with that moped accident. This was not a brain injury or anything connected to the trauma. However, her nosebleeds were connected to something else she had done while in Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, in between, going out to nightclubs and partying and trying all that great food, Angela was also swimming in these local rivers. And at one point, when she was in one of those rivers, something found its way into her nose. A 3-inch long blood-sucking leech. It had been living deep inside of Angela's nostril and sinus cavity for over a week, separated from her brain only by this extremely fragile bone that's only about a ½ millimeter thick. Hospital doctors would spend about 30 minutes painstakingly pulling this leech out of Angela's nose, and then once it was out, she would go on to make a full recovery. One morning in February of 1987, a 45-year-old woman named Janet Overton stood in front of her bathroom mirror inside of her home in Dana Point, California. Janet was a member of the board for the school district that her 17-year-old son attended, and she had a big meeting that day. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, she looked terrible. She was pale and exhausted, and she had these big dark circles under her eyes. Now, Janet knew why she looked this way. It's because the last couple of days, she'd felt really sick, kinda out of nowhere. She'd been all stuffed up, she had bouts of nausea off and on, she wasn't sleeping very well. She figured she just had a bad cold and hoped if she could just kind of muscle her way through it, she could avoid going to the doctor. But now here she was about to have this big school board meeting, still feeling sick, still looking terrible. But instead of kind of canceling her plans and going to the doctor, she just caked on more makeup, did up her hair, and headed out the door. A few weeks later, Janet suddenly woke up in the middle of the night feeling so nauseous that she leapt out of her bed and ran to the bathroom and vomited. And then afterwards, she just sat on the ground sweating and shaking. So over the last few weeks, Janet's cold had not really gone away. In fact, if anything, it had just gotten progressively worse. Now, Janet had gone to the doctor about it eventually, and the doctor had agreed with her that, maybe you do have some really bad cold or some other virus here. But the only thing they told her to do was just, rest and stay really well hydrated, and whatever this is, it'll just run its course. And so that's exactly what Janet had been doing over these several weeks, but it hadn't helped. Janet's nausea had gotten so bad and so severe that she basically couldn't eat. And then she had also fallen behind on her work for the school board because she was so weak all the time. Janet forced herself to stand up off the bathroom floor, then she turned on the sink and began splashing cold water on her face. But as she did that, she noticed something new. She saw there was this red, scaly rash on her arms. And so she stepped back and pulled her sleeves up, and she saw the rash extended up onto her shoulders and up onto her neck and down her back. And when she touched it, it really hurt. I mean, this is a brand new symptom here, and she could tell it had to be connected to whatever this mystery illness was, and it terrified her. Like, what was happening to her body? And so she decided that night she had to go to the ER. The next day, Janet laid in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm and her husband and her son sitting right beside her. She still felt absolutely horrible. She still felt nauseous, she had cold symptoms, and that rash had now spread up to her neck and onto her face, and it had begun to blister. All night, the doctors had been running tests on Janet to try to figure out what was going on. But every test they ran came back negative. She didn't have the flu, and she didn't have at least any known infections or diseases that could cause these symptoms. And so the doctors were at a loss. However, scans of Janet's abdomen did reveal something concrete. She had all these ulcers in her stomach, which basically are like open sores in her stomach lining. And so the doctors told her very likely it was these ulcers that were causing her extreme nausea and making it really hard to eat. But like everything else they were seeing with Janet, they had no idea why she was developing these ulcers in the first place. And so ultimately, all the doctors could really do for Janet was just treat her symptoms. They gave her ulcer medication, and they also gave her some topical treatments for her rash. And over the next couple of days, these treatments seemed to work. Her ulcers went away, and her rash basically disappeared, and overall she felt a lot better. Not back to 100%, but pretty close, to the point where she was discharged. And so Janet and the doctors were like, okay, we don't really know what this was or why it started. We just hope it never comes back. Several months later, on January 24th, 1988, Janet was at home getting ready for a whale watching trip with her 17-year-old son, and she felt horrible. Ever since leaving the hospital, she had periodically just kept getting sick over and over and over again. And each time she would go back to the hospital and they would just, treat her symptoms because no one could figure out what was wrong with her. And then eventually she'd get better and go back home and the cycle would repeat. And so on this particular day, even though Janet felt sick as a dog, she just told herself she was going to push through this and try to have a good day with her son on this whale watching trip. So she put on a ton of makeup, she put her hair up, slammed some coffee, and then went downstairs to meet her son. Then the two of them headed outside, walked over to the car, and right as Janet was about to grab the car door handle and get inside, she stood there for a second and then just collapsed. Janet's husband and son immediately rushed Janet to the hospital, but by the time they got there, it was already too late. Janet was dead. Her doctors were obviously baffled because they had been baffled for months now. Nobody knew what was happening to her. And so ultimately they brought in a coroner to do an autopsy to try to figure out once and for all what was going on with Janet. And as soon as the coroner cut open Janet's stomach to examine the contents, he was hit with this smell that was very distinct that instantly told him exactly what had killed Janet. And as soon as he smelled it, he stopped what he was doing and contacted the police. And the police immediately sent detectives to Janet's house, and they began gathering up all these items inside the house to be tested. And the results of these tests confirmed the coroner's theory. As Janet got sicker and sicker, she had this mentality of I'm gonna push through this thing and not go to the doctor. I'm just gonna pretend this isn't even happening. And so when she was caking on all that makeup every day and chugging all this coffee, to combat the tiredness, that was all just an effort to, pretend this wasn't really happening. But what she didn't realize is that the makeup and the coffee were actually killing her. It would turn out there was a deadly chemical in her makeup called selenium that was slowly killing her. And then in her coffee was cyanide. And cyanide has a very distinctive smell. It smells like almonds. And that's what the coroner smelled when he opened up her stomach. But these deadly chemicals did not appear in her makeup and coffee naturally. They were put there by Janet's husband. He believed Janet was having an affair, and so he set out to murder her. He first began placing the selenium in her makeup, and it was slowly killing Janet, but it was not happening fast enough. And so finally, on the day of the whale watching trip, her husband put the cyanide in her coffee, and it killed her pretty much right away. Richard Overton was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars in 2009. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, Mr. Ballin Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballinstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.